In the early months of 1942, the Pacific Ocean felt impossibly large, and to Japanese planners, it felt safe. Pearl Harbor had burned. American battleships lay wrecked or damaged. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed it had shattered the backbone of U.S. sea power. From Tokyo to Truk Lagoon, confidence ran high. The United States, they believed, would need years, maybe decades, to rebuild a fleet capable of challenging Japan's dominance in the Pacific. What Japanese commanders could not see, what their intelligence never fully grasped, was that America was already fighting a different kind of naval war. A war not centered on what floated at sea, but on what waited quietly beyond the horizon. A fleet that did not sail in parades or clash in decisive battles right away. A fleet that existed in blueprints, shipyards, steel mills, and dry docks. A fleet that would come back not as a handful of ships, but as an unstoppable tide. Before the war, American naval doctrine had been shaped by limitation treaties and budget restraints. Battleships were still symbols of power, but aircraft carriers were increasingly understood as the future. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, fate intervened in a crucial way. America's carriers were not in port. They survived, and while Japan celebrated the destruction it could see, the real danger was what it could not. Even before December 7th, American planners had anticipated a long war. They understood something fundamental about industrial warfare. Wars between great powers are not won by single strikes, but by sustained production. In factories stretching from the Great Lakes to the West Coast, shipbuilding programs were already expanding. Designs were simplified. Assembly line methods were adapted for warships. America was preparing to build not just replacements, but something entirely new. Japanese naval strategy had always relied on the idea of a decisive battle. Lure the enemy fleet across the Pacific, weaken it through attrition, then destroy it in a final confrontation. This strategy assumed one critical thing, that America would not be able to replace losses quickly. That assumption was about to become fatal. While Japanese carriers roamed the Pacific in early 1942, striking at Wake Island, Rabaul, and the Dutch East Indies, American shipyards were working around the clock. Workers poured steel day and night. Hulls took shape faster than anyone had thought possible. What once took years was now measured in months. In some cases, weeks. To Japanese intelligence officers, American ship production numbers seemed exaggerated. Reports were often dismissed as propaganda. The idea that the United States could build dozens of fleet carriers during a single war seemed absurd. Japan had spent years constructing each of its major carriers. America, they believed, simply lacked the experience and the discipline. They were wrong. America had something Japan did not. Depth. Depth of industry. Depth of resources. Depth of manpower. And perhaps most importantly, depth of time. The United States was not fighting for survival in 1942. Japan was. As the war expanded, Japan began to encounter American ships that should not have existed. Destroyers that looked new. Carriers that appeared after previous ones were supposedly sunk. Task forces that seemed to regenerate. For Japanese pilots and commanders, this was deeply unsettling. The ocean that once felt empty now seemed haunted. These ships did not arrive all at once. They emerged gradually, almost deceptively. A carrier here, a cruiser there. Each loss inflicted by Japan was answered, not immediately, but inevitably. Where Japan saw attrition, America saw calculation. Where Japan saw sacrifice, America saw replacement. The turning point was not a single battle, but a realization. A realization that the United States was not merely fighting with the fleet it had in 1941. By early 1942, Japan believed it understood the shape of the war it had unleashed. Pearl Harbor had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. American battleships lay burned and broken in the harbor, and Japanese planners convinced themselves that the United States would need years, perhaps a decade, to recover its naval strength. What Japan did not see, what it could not see, was the fleet that already existed beyond the horizon. Not a fleet of steel and firepower yet, but a fleet of plans, production schedules, shipyards working around the clock, and vessels that could appear, disappear, and reappear faster than any enemy intelligence could track. This unseen force would later earn a chilling nickname among Japanese commanders: America's Ghost Fleet. In Washington and Honolulu, U.S. naval leadership understood something critical that Japan underestimated. War would not be won solely by the ships already afloat, but by the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Even as flames still rose from Pearl Harbor, American industrial mobilization began transforming the United States into a naval factory on a scale the world had never witnessed. While Japanese admirals planned decisive battles meant to shatter the enemy in one stroke, American planners prepared for a war of endurance, deception, and relentless replacement. The Ghost Fleet was not one single armada. It was a system. Damaged ships were rushed to repair docks and returned to service in astonishing time frames. Vessels believed sunk would reappear months later, sometimes weeks, confusing Japanese intelligence officers who struggled to explain how American carriers kept returning to battle. Submarines rotated quietly between patrol zones, creating the illusion of far greater numbers. Escort carriers appeared where none were expected. And behind it all, new hulls slid into the water faster than Japan could count them. Nowhere did this phenomenon shock Japan more than in the Pacific Carrier War. Japanese doctrine centered on the belief that aircraft carriers were precious, limited assets, each one irreplaceable. Their pilots were elite, their decks sacred. Losses were catastrophic. American doctrine, by contrast, treated carriers as powerful but replaceable tools that could be built, repaired, and improved continuously. Japan did not expect the enemy to absorb blows and come back stronger every time. As battles unfolded across the Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomon Islands, Japanese commanders began encountering American ships they believed had already been destroyed. Reports reached Tokyo describing U.S. carriers that should not exist, task forces that vanished after engagements only to return with new aircraft and fresh crews. This was not magic. It was logistics, industrial depth, and strategic misdirection. But to Japanese officers operating under rigid assumptions, it felt like fighting a phantom enemy. The Ghost Fleet also thrived on secrecy. Ship movements were masked, repair schedules classified, and intelligence leaks tightly controlled. The United States learned quickly how to let Japan believe what it wanted to believe. When an American carrier withdrew after taking damage, Japanese reconnaissance often declared it sunk. American silence allowed the lie to grow. Weeks later, when that same carrier returned to action, Japanese pilots reacted with disbelief and hesitation. Fatal emotions in aerial combat. Submarines played an equally important role in sustaining the illusion. American submarines operated aggressively against Japanese shipping, often rotating boats through patrol areas so frequently that Japanese escorts believed they faced dozens of submarines, when in reality the same few were cycling through rearmament and redeployment. Merchant convoys reported attacks in multiple locations within days, reinforcing the sense that American undersea strength was limitless and omnipresent. This growing uncertainty gnawed at Japanese strategy. If the Americans always had more ships, more planes, more replacements, then decisive victory became impossible. Every sunk ship felt temporary. Every American loss seemed reversible. The psychological impact was immense. Japanese commanders began questioning their own intelligence, their own reports, and even their own eyes. Meanwhile, American shipyards worked at a pace that defied comprehension. Liberty ships, escort carriers, destroyers, and fleet carriers emerged in waves. The Ghost Fleet was becoming real, materializing from steel, rivets, and assembly lines. But Japan had already fallen behind in understanding its true scale. By the time Japanese planners realized the United States was not merely rebuilding, but expanding exponentially, the gap had become unbridgeable. This imbalance forced Japan into increasingly desperate strategies. Riskier operations were approved. Pilot training was shortened. Ships were pushed into combat before crews were fully prepared. The very existence of the Ghost Fleet distorted Japanese decision-making, driving choices rooted in fear and urgency rather than calculation. What made the Ghost Fleet so terrifying was not just its size, but its unpredictability. American forces could strike, withdraw, regroup, and strike again somewhere else entirely. Japanese defensive planning relied on predicting where the enemy would be. Against a fleet that seemed to multiply and teleport, prediction became impossible. By mid-war, Japanese officers privately admitted the truth. They were not fighting a fleet, they were fighting an industrial machine that could generate fleets on demand. Every engagement risked awakening another wave of American ships that had not even been counted yet. The Ghost Fleet was no longer invisible. It was everywhere. And yet, the most dangerous phase was still ahead. Because as Japan struggled to comprehend the fleets it could see, an even larger armada was still forming beyond the horizon. One that would soon overwhelm the Pacific entirely and transform the Ghost Fleet from nightmare into inevitability. By late 1942, Japanese naval planners were trying to understand a pattern that made no sense to them. American ships that intelligence reports had listed as sunk were somehow reappearing months later, sometimes even weeks. Battleships damaged beyond expectation were back in action. Destroyers thought lost were suddenly escorting convoys again. To Japanese analysts, it felt as if the United States possessed an invisible reserve navy, a fleet that existed somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen yet always present. What Japan did not yet realize was that America had turned logistics, repair, and industrial deception into a weapon of war. The so-called Ghost Fleet was not made of phantom ships, but of real steel vessels that refused to stay dead. Pearl Harbor had been meant to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet permanently. Instead, it triggered one of the most aggressive recovery operations in naval history. Ships that should have been written off were raised from the harbor floor, patched, modernized, and returned to combat. American salvage crews worked under conditions that bordered on impossible. Battleships like West Virginia and California were refloated from wreckage, stripped to their frames, and rebuilt better than before. New radar systems were installed. Anti-aircraft firepower was multiplied. Lessons learned from early defeats were physically welded into the ships themselves. When these vessels returned to sea, they were no longer the same ships Japan had studied before the war. At the same time, the United States began rotating damaged vessels out of combat zones with astonishing speed. Instead of abandoning ships overseas, they were towed, escorted, and repaired at forward bases or shipped back to the mainland. Dry docks operated day and night. Crews trained while repairs were still underway. The goal was simple: keep ships appearing faster than the enemy could destroy them. To Japanese commanders, this created a psychological nightmare. Naval warfare depended on attrition, on counting enemy losses and calculating remaining strength. But American losses refused to add up. Every battle seemed to end with the same question: how many ships does the United States actually have? The answer kept changing, always upward. The illusion of a Ghost Fleet grew stronger as American production accelerated. Even while damaged ships were being resurrected, entirely new ones were sliding into the water. Escort carriers, destroyer escorts, fleet oilers, and transports appeared in numbers Japan could not match. These ships did not always seek dramatic battles. Instead, they protected supply lines, hunted submarines, and ensured that American forces could strike again and again without pause. Japanese pilots and submarine commanders began reporting encounters with ships they believed had already been destroyed. Intelligence officers dismissed some reports as confusion or exaggeration, but the pattern persisted. The same silhouettes kept reappearing. The same hull numbers were spotted twice. It felt as though America's Navy could not be reduced, only delayed. Behind the scenes, deception played its role as well. Damaged ships were sometimes deliberately kept visible in port to draw enemy attention while operational fleets maneuvered elsewhere. Radio traffic suggested movements that never occurred. Fake repairs were staged while real ones happened in secret. The Ghost Fleet was as much an idea as it was a physical force. This was devastating for Japan's strategic planning. Every major operation relied on the assumption that American naval strength had limits. But the Ghost Fleet erased those limits. Each victory felt temporary. Dry docks operated day and night. Crews trained while repairs were still underway. The goal was simple: keep ships appearing faster than the enemy could destroy them. To Japanese commanders, this created a psychological nightmare. Naval warfare depended on attrition, on counting enemy losses and calculating remaining strength. But American losses refused to add up. Every battle seemed to end with the same question: how many ships does the United States actually have? The answer kept changing, always upward. The illusion of a ghost fleet grew stronger as American production accelerated. Even while damaged ships were being resurrected, entirely new ones were sliding into the water. Escort carriers, destroyer escorts, fleet oilers, and transports appeared in numbers Japan could not match. These ships did not always seek dramatic battles. Instead, they protected supply lines, hunted submarines, and ensured that American forces could strike again and again without pause. Japanese pilots and submarine commanders began reporting encounters with ships they believed had already been destroyed. Intelligence officers dismissed some reports as confusion or exaggeration, but the pattern persisted. The same silhouettes kept reappearing. The same hull numbers were spotted twice. It felt as though America's Navy could not be reduced, only delayed. Behind the scenes, deception played its role as well. Damaged ships were sometimes deliberately kept visible in port to draw enemy attention while operational fleets maneuvered elsewhere. Radio traffic suggested movements that never occurred. Fake repairs were staged while real ones happened in secret. The Ghost Fleet was as much an idea as it was a physical force. This was devastating for Japan's strategic planning. Every major operation relied on the assumption that American naval strength had limits. But the Ghost Fleet erased those limits. Each victory felt temporary. Each success carried the fear that the enemy would return stronger than before. By 1943, the truth was impossible to ignore. America's Navy was not just fighting battles. It was fighting time itself. Ships could be repaired faster than Japan could replace them. Crews could be retrained faster than losses could break morale. The Pacific had become a theater where destruction no longer guaranteed advantage. The Ghost Fleet did not announce its arrival with a single decisive moment. It haunted the war through repetition, through persistence, through the quiet terror of realizing that no matter how hard Japan struck, the sea would soon fill again with American hulls, American aircraft, and American flags. And this realization, more than any single defeat, began to erode Japan's confidence. Because you can plan against an enemy you can see, but how do you defeat a fleet that refuses to disappear? By late 1943, Japanese naval intelligence began noticing something deeply unsettling. American ships that had been reported damaged, sunk, or retired were somehow reappearing in combat zones months, or even weeks, later. To Japanese planners, it felt as if the United States possessed an endless supply of warships that refused to stay dead. What they could not see was the massive industrial miracle unfolding thousands of miles away, far from the Pacific battlefields. Across the American coastline, from California to the Gulf of Mexico, shipyards were operating day and night. Welders replaced riveters, prefabricated sections replaced slow hand-built hulls, and entire ships were being assembled the way automobiles once were. The United States had transformed naval warfare into an industrial process. Ships were no longer rare, handcrafted weapons. They were products built fast, repaired faster, and replaced without hesitation. Even more shocking was how damaged vessels were handled. Instead of being written off, many ships were rushed to floating dry docks or emergency repair bases closer to the front lines. Crews patched holes, replaced twisted steel, and restored engines under constant threat of attack. A ship that Japan would have scrapped as a total loss was often back in action under the American system within weeks. Japanese submariners and pilots began reporting the same hull silhouettes again and again. Ships struck by torpedoes reappeared as escorting convoys. Carriers damaged in one battle were seen launching aircraft in the next. To the Japanese command, this defied everything they believed about naval attrition. Their entire strategy relied on the idea that losses were permanent, that each sunk ship permanently weakened the enemy. What Japan did not fully grasp was that America was not fighting a war of numbers alone. It was fighting a war of logistics, repair capacity, and industrial depth. The so-called Ghost Fleet was not supernatural at all. It was the visible edge of an invisible system. Factories, railroads, oil refineries, training bases, and shipyards all working as one enormous weapon. As the war dragged on, the psychological impact became just as damaging as the physical one. Japanese commanders began doubting their own battle reports. Pilots questioned whether their attacks had achieved anything at all. Submarine captains wondered if sinking an American ship even mattered anymore. The ocean seemed to swallow American losses and then give them back, stronger and more numerous than before. This realization marked a turning point. Japan was no longer fighting a navy. It was fighting an industrial civilization that could absorb punishment without slowing down. And for the first time, Japanese leadership began to understand that no matter how brave their sailors were, or how skilled their pilots remained, they were facing an enemy whose strength regenerated faster than it could be destroyed. By late 1943, the war in the Pacific had begun to change in ways Japanese planners never truly anticipated. On paper, Japan still possessed powerful warships, experienced crews, and vast stretches of ocean it claimed to control. But beneath the surface of the Pacific, something invisible was gathering strength, something that did not rely on battleships, carrier decks, or dramatic fleet engagements. It relied on patience, silence, and relentless pressure. This was America's so-called Ghost Fleet. The Japanese Navy had built its doctrine around decisive surface battles. Submarines, in Japanese thinking, were tools for scouting and fleet support, not commerce destruction. American naval planners thought very differently. From the opening weeks of the war, U.S. submarines were assigned a single, brutal mission: strangle Japan's lifeline. Japan was an island empire that survived on imports. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, iron or from Southeast Asia, bauxite, rubber, food, everything had to move by sea. Every barrel of fuel, every ton of steel, every bag of rice passed through narrow shipping lanes. The ocean was not just Japan's battlefield. It was Japan's bloodstream. At first, the submarine campaign stumbled. Faulty torpedoes ran too deep, exploded too early, or failed entirely. American skippers risked their boats, fired perfect shots, and watched enemy ships sail away untouched. But by mid-1943, those problems were fixed. And once they were fixed, the Ghost Fleet became lethal. American submarines did not announce themselves. They did not raise flags or challenge enemy escorts. They appeared at night, in rain squalls, in shallow coastal waters where Japanese commanders believed submarines could not operate. They attacked alone, far from support, trusting only in training and nerve. A single submarine could shut down an entire shipping route. One well-placed torpedo could send a tanker carrying months of fuel to the bottom. Another could sink a freighter loaded with aircraft parts that Japan had no way to replace. These losses did not make headlines, but they quietly hollowed out Japan's war effort. Japanese sailors began to fear the ocean itself. Convoys sailed with inadequate escorts. Sonar was scarce, radar even scarcer. Many destroyers were tied to fleet duties and could not spare time to protect merchant ships. Depth charges were often dropped blindly, more for morale than effectiveness. American submariners exploited every weakness. They learned Japanese shipping schedules, studied tidal charts, memorized harbor approaches. Some captains stalked the same routes for weeks, striking again and again. Others slipped directly into enemy anchorages, torpedoing ships at rest, then escaping under fire. The psychological effect was devastating. Japanese merchant crews knew that rescue was unlikely. Lifeboats were few. Escorts could not stop to pick up survivors. When a ship was hit, it was often a death sentence. Morale collapsed, and experienced sailors became harder to replace. By 1944, the results were undeniable. Japan's oil reserves plummeted. Warships were forced to limit training exercises. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. New pilots were rushed into combat with minimal training because there was no gasoline to train them properly. Factories still existed, but raw materials could not reach them. Finished weapons could not be delivered to the front. Entire garrisons were left to starve on bypassed islands, not because American troops attacked them, but because submarines made resupply impossible. The Ghost Fleet operated in near total secrecy. Submarines returned to base with no parades, no press coverage. Their victories were counted in tonnage sunk, not enemy flags captured. Yet by the end of the war, U.S. submarines, less than 2% of the Navy's personnel, had destroyed more than half of Japan's merchant marine. Japanese commanders later admitted the truth. They had never prepared for a sustained submarine war. They had underestimated American industrial capacity, American adaptability, and American willingness to fight an unseen war without glory. The ocean that once protected Japan became a trap. Every voyage was a gamble. Every wake might be watched. Every shadow could be death. America's Ghost Fleet did not win the war in a single battle. It won by making victory impossible for Japan, day by day, ship by ship, until the empire simply ran out of fuel, food, and hope. By late 1944, Japan finally understood what the Ghost Fleet truly was. Not abandoned ships, not obsolete hulls, but time itself turning against them. Every month, the war dragged on. The United States launched more carriers, more destroyers, more tankers, more aircraft than Japan could replace in years. What had once looked like empty harbors and rusting silhouettes had quietly become a reserve of momentum, waiting for the moment it would be unleashed. American sailors spoke of ships appearing as if from nowhere. Task forces that Japanese planners believed destroyed returned under new hull numbers. Damaged carriers vanished into the Pacific fog and reappeared months later, repaired, modernized, and deadlier than before. To Japan's naval command, it felt as though the enemy possessed an endless second life. The illusion shattered completely when Japanese reconnaissance began encountering entire formations they had never accounted for. Radar contact multiplied. Carrier decks filled the horizon. Submarines reported convoys so large they could not count the ships before losing contact. Pilots returned describing floating cities of steel, aircraft rising in waves that blotted out the sky. This was the Ghost Fleet's final form. Not ships hiding in reserve, but ships reborn faster than they could be destroyed. At Leyte Gulf, Japan gambled everything on one last decisive battle. Their strategy assumed American losses would thin the enemy's strength, forcing hesitation. Instead, the U.S. Navy absorbed damage, rerouted ships, replaced losses, and continued advancing without pause. Escort carriers fought like fleet carriers. Destroyers charged battleships. And behind them all stood an industrial machine that erased defeat almost as soon as it occurred. Japanese officers later admitted the truth in testimony and memoirs. They had planned for courage, skill, and sacrifice. They had not planned for replacement. They had not planned for a nation that treated ships as renewable resources rather than irreplaceable treasures. Every sunk Japanese cruiser was permanent. Every lost pilot was irreplaceable. Every destroyed dockyard echoed for months. Meanwhile, American shipyards worked day and night, launching hulls faster than Japan could even name them. Crews trained on new ships while old ones were still fighting. Warships were no longer handcrafted relics. They were products of a system designed for scale. The Ghost Fleet was not invisible. It was underestimated. Japan believed war would be decided by a single catastrophic blow. America believed war would be decided by endurance. And endurance won. By 1945, Japanese sailors no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of inevitability. They knew that even if they sank a carrier, another would replace it. If they destroyed a convoy, two more would follow. The sea itself seemed to side with their enemy. The Ghost Fleet haunted Japan not because it struck unseen, but because it could not be killed. When the war ended, American harbors filled again, this time with ships waiting not for battle, but for mothballs. Rows upon rows of carriers, destroyers, submarines, and transports rested quietly, just as they had before the war. The same fleet that terrified Japan now slept, ready if history demanded it again. That was the final lesson of the Ghost Fleet. Power was not just firepower. It was preparation. It was patience. It was the ability to lose today and return stronger tomorrow. And in World War II, that ability made America unstoppable.